Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 9th of May, is Victory Day in a lot of Eastern European countries, a lot of the Western European countries, and a lot of countries like the United States, for instance, held their own commemorations on the 8th of May. And just as a historical fun fact, a lot of that has to do with the time zones because when the Nazis surrendered, it was apparently just after midnight in local time in Russia and in the Soviet Union as a whole, whereas in Western Europe, in the United States, it was still May 8th. So that's just sort of the background behind that. And ever since the war, the Ukrainians have been celebrating Victory Day on the 8th of May, and they had their services in the United Kingdom. And in contrast, today the Russians had their ceremony where they invited 20 other leaders of various countries that they recognize. So, just to get into the updates, I want to look at the past 7 days of developments because I just haven't been here for it. I'm extremely busy and I'm going to try to rectify that today. But I just can't promise any consistent uploads up until like late June when I'm done with all my exams. Let's begin though by zooming in on the major updates beginning with Velyka Novosilka. And of course, we're going to finish off by looking at the Ukrainian infiltrations into Kursk yet again, specifically around Tetkino this time. But as you guys can see, there have been a lot of substantial movements and a lot of Russian intensification of ground maneuvers in the days leading up to the Victory Day ceasefire, which was declared for the midnight of May 8th all the way until midnight of May 11th. Although when it comes to the facts on the ground, when it comes to reports of UAV strikes, airstrikes as a whole, clashes between both sides on the ground, and movement and territory captured. None of that has stopped completely. There has been definitely a reduction noted, and that's been mentioned in Ukraine's daily situational reports, but nothing that indicates a complete halt. We have a lot of evidence to the contrary. But let's begin by looking at a just broad update. The Russian forces have been able to really push deep and seize a lot of open fields that the Ukrainians simply are unable to hold on to anymore. Areas that are simply not that well defended, the Ukrainians would rather opt to fall back to more defensive, defendable positions in populated areas like Novopil, Zelenopole. There is a solid line of defense over here, including basements and some trenches that aren't fully shown on the map over here in the satellite imagery, but there definitely are a lot of trenches and dugouts built in just to the east of some of these villages. Whereas areas a bit to the east that you can see over here are largely open. There are a couple of hedgerows and such, but really they are exposed, and a lot of the foliage has been, of course, damaged, making it difficult to use said foliage for concealment. The Russian forces have been able to push over here with less resistance than usual, and as a result, we're able to take over nearly 14 square kilometers. It is a substantial amount, and the Ukrainian formations are trying to reorganize their line of defense pretty close to the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia in this particular location. There's a geolocation here from May 7th. This is from the 3rd Presidential Battalion of the 1st Presidential Brigade. So they conducted FPV strikes onto those Russian soldiers that were advancing and approaching areas like Novopil, and you could see how in the process they seized a lot of the areas adjacent to this pond. And they also advanced north of Novosilka. The western part of the hamlet remains a gray zone, but just to the north, this large sliver of territory, which actually runs through this paved road that connects between Vilnipola to Novosilka, it's currently under Russian control for the most part. And you can see an additional capture of 3.5 square kilometers of territory. So this is from May 3rd. Again, we're looking back a week now, but it is important to recap. 17th National Guard Brigade, one of these newer units incorporated into the National Guard, and in recent months, it's been given a lot of responsibility along this specific part of the front line. So they conducted FPV strikes onto those Russian soldiers and struck their dugouts in trenches. You can see, based on the measuring stick, the horizontal advance around 1.3 kilometers westwards. 31st Mechanized Brigade is also one of the primary units involved in defensive activity over here at the moment, preventing a Russian deep penetration. Because with the fall of Vilnipola, the Russians would have an opportunity to push forward at a maximum extent approaching 6.5 kilometers westwards, all the way to Komishyuvacha, which would be the final village before reaching the border with Dnipro. And that would create a lot of opportunities for the Russians to flank villages further south, like Zelenopole, flank the large town of Shevchenko, one of the largest in this entire region, where you do have just a cluster of hamlets and villages that are pretty close together. They're not compact, but they are within a pretty good driving distance for a motorcycle, for instance. And then the Russians, by having this sort of forward operating base, would also be able to project power and approach the defense lines built by the Ukrainians that are supposed to separate the Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, and Donetsk borders, respectively. So that's all a part of Russia's thinking right now, and it all starts with taking over large-scale territories and fields that the Ukrainians cannot hold on to in order to shape the battlefield in such a way that the Ukrainians in their populated areas that they do try to dig in within, they are isolated and their firebacks created, and the logistics and roads leading into those settlements come under increased fire. Also, we can see over here that just to the northwest of Rozdolnia, the Russians have captured 3.7 square kilometers of territory. This just is a further capitalization on the fact that the Ukrainians are largely focusing on Oleksivka and Bakhatir directly. They have very little resources devoted to defending Odradny or even the eastern flank of Khmar at the moment, because likewise, the Russians are not investing the bulk of their resources on advancing northwest of Rozdolnia, but even the limited amount of forces that are involved in these attacks are able to advance on foot and sometimes use motorcycles to just push through large chunks of these hedgerows and do so with minimal resistance on the ground. Although there are drone crews that are involved in spotting those Russian soldiers, it acts as an incentive to be more careful and advance during the night. And then also, it does lead to casualties. So the main unit involved with defense over here would be the 180th Battalion of 118th TDF Brigade, and perhaps also the 123rd TDF Brigade, maybe even the 20th Special Purpose Battalion of the Presidential Brigade. They're generally deployed to this region. But when we want to zoom in, I would say that the most interesting development from this region is from Bakhatir, because we now have the Russians entering into the village from the south. This geolocation indicates that the Russians captured over the past couple of days 2.1 square kilometers of territory. This video from May 9th is from the Shadow FPV group. So they're usually attached to the 72nd Brigade, but they are their own independent unit. And now they're operating around here, whereas the 72nd Brigade is operating further northwards on the border with Dnipro. So in this video, they conducted FPV strikes and they dropped grenades onto individual Russian soldiers. First, they were seen approaching the village and they were able to advance through this plot of land over here. But then they were able to entrench themselves in the houses, and we don't have any proof to the contrary that they've been taken out and removed by the Ukrainian side. So it does appear that the Russians have achieved this now seemingly permanent bridgehead foothold within the village, within the eastern chunk of this area. And that means the Russians will have a clear cut out route through which to situate further forces and seep deeper into the village, clear out individual houses, clear out basements and such. So that will be the next Russian target. And from there, Oleksivka is on the chopping block. You have this large excess piece of territory that is east of Bakhatir that just conventionally have marked as under Ukrainian control, but in reality is not really solid when it comes to Ukraine's presence, because you can see that it's located on a floodplain. It's just way too close to the front line in an outstretched pockets, and Oleksivka is where most of the Ukrainian soldiers are situated. So this 11 square kilometer piece of territory, or 6 square kilometers rather, it's not necessarily falling into Russian hands imminently, but the opportunity is over there that is really presenting itself if the Russians are able to continue up with momentum in Bakhatir, for this sliver of territory to also fall into Russian hands, and then from there for the momentum to shift towards taking over Oleksivka itself. You can see how the battle is developing, and it all has to do with the capture of Rozliv, because Rozliv unlocked the southern flank to attack Bakhatir rather than the frontal advance coming from Kostyantynivka. Now, when we look at the Dnipro front, a couple of positional advances, for instance, this 1 square kilometer capture of just a couple of open fields, but you do still have the large Ukrainian crescent shape over here defending this outstretched position. It's really important from a Ukrainian perspective to ensure this region remains under their steady control because it prevents the Russians from sending in armored columns or infantry on foot to maneuver and attack Orikhiv from the north, or for that matter, any village that runs along the Vavj River or its nearby highway. So that's just the thinking behind Ukraine's defensive uh, standing and refusal to withdraw. Over here, we could see that the Russian forces are getting very close to reaching the Dnipro border. So, at the closest extent, we know that the Russians are only, what is this, 2.6 kilometers away. So, it's a pretty short distance. It's a walking distance, surely. And DRGs could probably do that at this point in time without being immediately spotted by Ukrainian drone crews. So there's a high likelihood, and this has also been reported on by the Ukrainian side, that there are Russian DRGs active around here past Kotlyarivka that are already making the initial contact with the border with Dnipro and trying to get a gauge of the Ukrainian defensive structure, both in these tree lines over here and then also the main one where you have the anti-tank ditch that is running vertically, basically perpendicular to the Horikovo village. So Russian forces for a while had tried to break through the Ukrainian line via Bogdanivka, which is a really small hamlet, but nonetheless, Ukrainian drone crews they display their ability to repel Russian attacks and cause a lot of damage on the route to the village because the Russian vehicles would come in from Yasnove and they would largely rely on this route over here. It's a really drawn out vector to attack through, like 7 kilometers through open fields adjacent to this gully, and it became extremely difficult to keep that up. And so now Russian forces have just opted to directly attack through Zaporizhzhia, push westwards along this paved road, which already gives them access to ground that is more conducive for attacks versus attacking through some areas that are just on open terrain. And then they, as a result, entered into Troitsk. This video is from May 7th. So the Bulava FEV group, which is also associated with the 72nd Brigade, but more closely, they conducted FEV strikes and also grenade drops onto singular Russian soldiers as they were entering into Troitsk. They were also seen as they walked through open fields to approach the village. And it is directly connected to Horikovo, so the fall of Troitsk will just inevitably lead Russian forces from the same units to seep into Horikovo, and then from there, the roads also lead to the border, and that will be the first instance of a Russian infiltration to Dnipro. So we're getting very close to that period of time. In isolation, crossing over an arbitrary line doesn't have much importance, but politically speaking, there is a certain level of importance. First of all, from a PR perspective, the idea of adding in another Oblast into the scene, into the Overton window of discussion for potential peace negotiations, which I know is definitely not something that's the number one concern for the Russians right now, given the stalemate and the deadlock that's just continued with the negotiations. But in any case, it is still good for the Russians to at least have their foot in the door and have that possibility open for them. And then also from a tactical perspective, getting control over areas that are located on key heights that overlook some Ukrainian rear logistics bases and artillery bases. That also has its own utility. Like, definitely the Russians would like to make moves to eventually overrun an area like Novopavlivka and all of the associated villages like Mezhova. So that's important on a tactical level. And also, of course, overrunning Ukraine's defensive lines over here, also a very important objective on the ground, which has nothing to do with whether or not it's an arbitrary border or not. Like, we know that these trenches are over here, and the Russians, they are close to it and would opt to try to take them over. Now, we could also see the Russians developing this salient of attack through Kotlyarivka, and this is an area where they've been even more successful than with Troitsk, for instance. So you can see they captured over here 2 square kilometers of territory. There's a video from May 3rd of Russian motorcyclists entering into Kotlyarivka. And over the past 2 days, there have been ground clashes between the 72nd Brigade and Russian forces. I'm not sure which ones they are from. I would say that if we're looking at armored support, the 80th Tank Regiment is generally floating around here. 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, they should be operating in this region along with the 228th Motor Rifle Regiment. But, there have been a lot of recent rotations of Russian forces. And so a lot of forces that were operating not necessarily here, but further south around the Krakowa region, they were recently moved up northwards to of course, engage with the Pokrovsk Highway and areas nearby that we'll get to later on. But nonetheless, the Russians do have a core base over here that doesn't just rely on a singular means of attack. The Russians have, employed a wide variety of means of firepower, but also means of advance. It's very fluid because sometimes the Russians will rely on these armored columns to push through, and a lot of cases that could be conducive because of the open terrain over here. It's very infighting for that. At the same time, though, there were a lot of hedgerows, so troops could also advance on foot. And so there were videos released from Kotlyarivka of Russian soldiers getting killed by Ukrainians at close distance, giving us an indication that clashes are still ongoing over here. But given the size of Kotlyarivka, the Russians definitely have the upper hand. And after Kotlyarivka, as we said, it's only 2.6 kilometers before reaching the border itself. And another concern is that the Russians could also turn north and take over this region that I'm marking in red, this large open area where you currently have the 11th National Guard Brigade and the 59th Assault Brigade. And this region acts as a buffer zone, like a 5 kilometer buffer zone in between the current salient that you see around Kotlyarivka and Adivka and the Solana River line. This river line, it contains many villages that are important, that are adjacent to trenches, that are also in their own right entrenched because of all the basements in them. So the Russians would, of course, want to overrun those positions, whereas the Ukrainians want to keep as much distance as possible between the Russian line of contact and whatever ground engagements are going on. So besides that, we also know the Russians captured 0.75 square kilometers over here just to the east of Kotlyarivka, potentially trying to probe the line over here, the northern flank, and see what the possibilities are of advancing northwards towards some populated rivers along the river valley. Because in conjunction, we know that the Russians have now been able to enter into Novosilka. They did so following their capture of Uspanivka, which gave them the necessary amount of galvanization to push forward. And this is largely coming from the 907th Motor Rifle Regiment, one of these new units, and also perhaps the 506th Motor Rifle Regiment. You could see they captured 2 square kilometers of territory and entered into this warehouse region, but the rest of the village remains under control of one of the battalions of the 59th Brigade. So clashes continue over there. There's also been this interesting phenomenon recently of Russian DRGs using diving equipment and swimming underwater through the Solona River, and it's a pretty narrow river, but they are able to dive through it, and that's how they're able to basically reach enemy lines. They just do so by swimming through and then getting out near floodplain, and from there consolidating positions. So based on that geolocation of Russian divers being spotted and targeted with grenade drops, we know that the Russians have advanced another nearly 4 square kilometers of territory north of Uspanivka, and that all sets the stage up for an attack on Novosilka, being one of the closest villages and directly connects to a road network that then approaches all the way to Novopavlivka if you continue southwestwards. If we were to look up Pokrovsk, there's only one update of notes, and that is the Russian advance, rather deep advance through an area that is pretty surprising, I would say, because the Ukrainians have invested a lot in their defensive wherewithal along this southern perimeter of Pokrovsk, but nonetheless, the Russians were able to achieve an advance amounting to zero point 0.3 square kilometers of territory, 9.3, I should say, and they advanced 1.9 square kilometers nearly. You could see there's a video over here from the umbrella drone units attached to the 32nd Brigade. Their FPVs, they struck Russian soldiers that were hiding in basements. There was like, and this happens in a lot of houses in Ukraine. There are the regular basement openings, and then even outside a house, just sort of adjacent to the house, there is a door that can be opened, and then from there you just have a shaft and you go into the basement from the outside. And so a lot of Russian forces, whenever they experience these drone attacks, they just immediately run and try to conceal themselves in these basements. But a lot of the time, if they're a skilled drone operator, they can maneuver the drone in such a way that it goes through the opening, through the door, and then it explodes in a tight, compact area where the Russian soldiers are hiding. And that leads to casualties for whatever squads hiding in those areas. But based on that exact geolocation, we can now say that the Russians have infiltrated into Zverove, which is one of these important villages that, on its own, it doesn't seem like a crisis for the Ukrainian side. It's not the end of the world for the defensive capacity over here. We know that, for instance, this video from May 1st showed that there were two Russian DRGs from 74th Motor Rifle Brigade that entered into the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk city itself, not even a suburb, and they were quickly pushed back and killed by the 155th Mechanized Brigade. And so there is precedent for this. But in the days since the severe breakthrough, the Ukrainian side has been unable to push them back, and this time it does appear to be a more permanent state of affairs. What this means is that now there are two choices for the Russian garrison over here. They can shift focus momentarily to just clear out the outstretched Ukrainian positions located south of their current breakthrough. So I'm marking it over here. They would have to exert pressure onto Ukrainian forces from the Skala regiment, and as a result, get control over this area that stretches from Zvirovet all the way to Pischane, the industrial zone, and that would eliminate a lot of the pressure on Russia's forward organization points in Pischane. Then from there, they can have a more unified, strong front to attack towards Leontovichi, or they can just continue and attack head on into this region right now, which is currently under the responsibility of the 93rd Brigade and also 68th Jaeger Brigade. But you can see how, as a result, the Russians are now beginning to get very close to the state boundaries of Pokrovsk on a just permanent basis. It's only about 2 kilometers away. And that's even after the Ukrainians built 2 layers to surround the perimeter of the city in recent months before the Russians obviously were able to approach the city at such a close distance. And also, given the troop redeployments, the sending of forces to this area specifically for defensive stabilization and then for localized counterattacks. Nonetheless, now the energy shifting and the Russians have been able to enter into Zhirove. So we'll keep an eye out for that. But an area that I've consistently talked about, and this has been for the course of a year now, ever since the capture of Cheritina, and are actually beginning to see that the Russians are achieving deep advances over here. It would be the Kostyantynivka front. That's how I'm going to refer to it, because the Russian movements indicate that there is an attempt to unify the front line that is being circled over here in the Toretsk front in order to create a unified movement to then attack Kostyantynivka from the south. It appears that Chasiv Yar, for the time being, is just going to remain in its current status quo because the Ukrainians have been able to create this arrangement where they are able to prevent deep Russian advances and really keep everything on a positional level. So, to get back into the topic at hand, first of all, the Russians captured the southern chunk of Myrylyubivka. This accounts for 0.85 square kilometers of territory, and it's from May 5th. So, the Typhoon Drone Company, I think that's like a new drone unit that's attached to the National Guard as a whole. So, it's a unique unit. This is from May 5th. Their company, they struck Russian infantry vehicles and tanks that were spotted around the village. And this gives us an idea that the Russians are now moving in additional resources to this area to take over the village in its entirety, because there still remains this northern chunk that is unaccounted for, that we haven't received any information about in recent weeks. But it does appear that the Ukrainians still remain around here. And the concern is that with this capture of Myrylyubivka, the Russians will have the really important positions located north of Hrdivka to just fully seal off, fully take over any Ukrainian movement, any Ukrainian presence that's sort of on the outskirts, the periphery of Hrdivka. And what that would mean is that the Russians would have a permanent organization point in Hrdivka, being a really large town in this area for forces to operate through, and would no longer have to deal with the Ukrainian line of trenches that is basically situated right outside of it, consistently hosting Ukrainian operators, drone operators, and firing points to target the Russians in Hrdivka. So, with the end of that sort of nearby harassment and the end of any sort of nearby pockets of resistance, there would be a really strong forward operating base that would be unhindered by defensive obstacles to push through these open fields and begin putting direct pressure on the Myrnihad. So that could definitely be a part of the Russian thinking with their movements in Myrylyubivka, and that all came down to the Russians taking the risk of crossing over the Toretsk River and then eventually succeeding due to the lack of Ukrainian reinforcements being deployed to this area on time. Now, you do have some units operating around here. You have 38th Marine Brigade generally floating around here. You have elements of the 117th TDF Brigade that are either here or a bit further to the northeast. And I added in the Typhoon Drone Company recently. When it comes to Kostyantynivka front, You can see that the Russians captured what amounts to 4.5 square kilometers of territory nearly, and this is running along T-054 highway. So north of Berezivka, the Russians captured territory. They took over this trench and anti-tank ditch, along with reaching the southern outskirts of Novopavlivka, which is an area that hitherto had not been within the range of like gun battles, Russian DRG activity, or anything like that. It's being added into the fray for the first time. So the Russian forces were spotted twice. On May 4th, the 117th Brigade conducted FPV strikes on houses over here. And there was also footage of a Russian armored vehicle as dismounted infantry. So we're seeing a combination. We're seeing not any large columns. We are seeing two or three armored vehicles, MTLBs and such, dismounting forces in these areas. The forces get out and try to just seep themselves into the basements. And then from May 7th, 117th Brigade once again conducting grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers that were spotted roaming through southern Novopoltavka. So this is now appearing to be a Russian effort to just get permanently settled into this area, get a permanent foothold, and from there sort of squeeze out any excess Ukrainian positions that are east of the highway over here, for instance, because it acts as a sort of distraction and buffer between the Russian objectives of, first of all, using the highway freely to reach Kostyantynivka, and then more generally creating a wide salient to begin broader attacks to overrun trench lines that were built by the Ukrainians that are supposed to, bog down the Russians. You can see them over here in yellow, and I'm just going over them, highlighting them in red for you guys. To just give you guys an indication of the density of defenses built by the Ukrainians. The question is whether the Ukrainians, once the Russians reach some of these areas, will have the impetus and will have the immediate pool of reserves needed to address any concerns and any potential attacks. For the time being, though, we are still looking at the front line south of Kostyantynivka. The Russians have expanded further into Novosilka, taking over another zero point 0.7 square kilometers of territory, and this is from May 6th. So the 33rd and 255th regiments, both a part of the 20th Motor Rifle Division, they fully captured Novosilka, and this was a pretty short process actually, but it was laid out in great detail by Russian channels. So they started off with artillery barrages and with FPV strikes onto Ukrainian infantry and vehicles, and also on foot as they were getting out. A group of Ukrainian soldiers was actually filmed, and they were not struck as they were withdrawing along sort of this forested region along a tree line further northwards along the Biochuk River. At the same time, though, you had Russian forces entering in along with armored vehicles and on motorcycles to enter into the northern part of this village. And then by the end of the video, they raised the Russian flag. They also took 7 Ukrainians POW. There are a lot of nearby trenches that the Ukrainians were likely trying to prepare in time for a Russian attack and infiltration, but they were caught by surprise and never had the ability to exert the, I suppose, whatever defensive traits they were able to acquire and use whatever geography had sort of been set up for them to their advantage because they already had surrendered. So you have 7 Ukrainians taking PW around here. We also have east of Tarasivka, the Russians advancing another 7.5 square kilometers, taking over most of Alexandropil. This gives us, once again, the impression that the Russian forces are trying to squeeze out the Ukrainians from these pockets. There's a large pocket as a whole, which is currently in the process of being cleansed by the Russian movements, which is sandwiched in between Toretsk and Novosilka, this region over here. This is also a large scale pocket, largely occupying areas that are open in nature, and then a couple of villages that are connected by, 2 kilometer, 3 kilometer drives. You can see that with Alexander Peel, though, the capture would give the Russian forces the opportunity to advance along a paved road, enter into Zoria, and then from there extend control to the remaining villages around here. And then also at the same time, it provides them with this important western flank to directly apply physical pressure to the Ukrainian squads that are currently resisting in between these 2 flanks. So that's something to keep an eye out for. You could also see that with Stara Mykolaievka, the Russians captured another 4.4 square kilometers of territory, and that amounts to this footage over here from May 4th of the Pastor's Bird Unit. It's a part of the 109th Brigade. So they're situated around here and have been for a very long time. So their strikes hit Staraya Mykolaievka. That was in response to the Russians entering into the village. Now we know that it is partially contested. I would say it's in a gray zone for the most part, because Ukrainian ground forces are not necessarily being sent in to conduct counterattacks against Russian forces. It's mainly drone crews that are operating several kilometers northwards, perhaps in some basement, but not necessarily around here right now. And they are the ones directing the attacks towards the Russian forces that are continuing to advance. And now they are pretty close to Nadivka as well. And you can see, based on these recent movements, that a really deep sand is also formed over here, way to the east, in between Kalinova and Sukhabalka. This amounts to about 7.6 kilometers from south to north, and really that is a really long vertical stretch. Horizontally, we could see that this pocket region over here amounts to 2.4 kilometers from east to west. So that's just an estimation of the size of Ukrainian pockets of resistance around here. And we all know that the Russians are now converging through multiple vectors of attack, all with the objective of physically cutting off the Ukrainians or squeezing them out in such a way that allows the Russians to maximize territorial gains without being treated any more so than they already had. When it comes to the situation in Toretsk, we have an issue because some recent geolocations, and this is a problem because a lot of footage is archival, but what's being claimed is that this footage is recent and it's from Druzhba, of Ukrainian soldiers being spotted and targeted by grenade drops. And that would give us an indication that, once again, we have Ukrainian presence from the perimeter entering into the city, entering into adjacent suburbs as well. So that gives us an idea of where the current line of contact is in current engagements. But I'm just not going to change the map to reflect that just yet until I get more solid information on that. You can see over here that the Russians captured 4.8 square kilometers of territory. You can see it spans from Krimska all the way to Dnipro. That amounts to nearly 3 square kilometers of territory. Not square. I don't know why I say square. It's about 4.8 square kilometers of territory. And then you could see that Dnipro itself has largely been taken over by the Russian side. So this is from the 152nd Recon Company. So one of the key units involved in defense over here, and has been for a while. So they conducted grenade drops on to the Russian positions near Dnipro, you should say, and that gives us an indication of where the Russian furthest extent of attacks currently is located and how it bases itself off of advances near this rail line and its adjacent windbreaks. So it definitely will be interesting to see how the Russians end up dealing with many of these pockets, many of them being deep, but because the sort of cutting edge forces, the cutting edge vanguard, are so small in size, they are more difficult to spot, and they're not going to go out and engage with an entire company worth of Russian soldiers. And we'll talk about this with the Kursk border. They would much prefer their drone crews do a lot of the work for them, whereas they are the ones that are just hiding out and dragging out fighting for as long as possible within certain pockets, areas that could be to the west or to the east, as you can see based on the map right now. Looking northwards, I do want to zoom in on Verkhovno because we do have a Russian report coming out of 4 square kilometers of territory being captured. And this is largely in eastern Verkhovno. We should know that, for 2 years now, the Russian side has been trying to take it over in its entirety. It got closest, you could say, October of last year, because that's when a drone dropped a flag of the Russian Federation and tried to sell it off as a Russian sort of symbol. They captured the village. That ended up being inaccurate. So for the time being, the Ukrainians remain in control of this region in western Verkhovno. We also know that as a whole, nearly 4 square kilometers was taken over by the Russian side in this location. And we could see just a couple of other pieces of evidence, or not evidence, but just pieces of territory that were taken over by the Russian side. This is just south of Bilohorivka. It's near this large mountain. It amounts to 3.2 square kilometers of territory. And you can see over here in Horivka, the Russians captured about 1.05 square kilometers of territory. And you could see as a result that this sliver of territory, this, say, salient, is becoming harder and harder to defend because there aren't any suitable trenches or populated areas. It's just largely open patches of land, and then also some forested areas in between that. So that's about the extent of the salient over here, and that means there is viability for just falling and being taken over in its entirety. Now, with that all being said, I want to look at the situation in or around the Zaporizhzhia riverfront. You can see over here capture of 2.86 square kilometers of territory just south of Yampolivka. Based on this video from May 3rd of the VDAR grenade units, they conducted grenade drops onto houses in northern Toretsk, and now when it comes to the Luhansk region and also the Donetsk and Kharkiv regions as a whole, we're going to see some additional movement. So regarding Novid, the Russian forces have been able to expand horizons both north and south of the town. This amounts to 2.6 square kilometers of territory plus another 1.7 square kilometers of territory. So Nova itself is now in a situation where it's sort of insulated from all directions, and it's going to be used as a forward base to begin attacking areas like Lipove, Zelena Dolina, Ridkodub, any sort of town that comes to mind. And this also gives the Russian side control over the railway, control over not the railway, but the highway. You can see that over here with the highway that leads in further northwards. This paved road that you see marked over here in red, or rather the extent of the paved road moving southwards all the way to the northern perimeter of Lyman. Over here in Novopavlivka, the Russians captured another 11.4, not 11.45 square kilometers, still substantial amounts that we're looking at for a singular update because it happened over the course of a week. But it still is interesting to note that the pace of advances is wrapping up because we're not seeing clashes centered around a single village, because once it is, then the Ukrainians are able to reduce the effects of having a smaller, I suppose, disposition to using parts of their arsenal, and also issues with the amount of manpower in a specific engagement. I'm not talking about as a whole right now, but just in certain engagements, it could be more difficult when the Russian forces are moving in several layers of attack, whereas the Ukrainians just try to use a small group to break through, and now they're going to have to deal with that. So that's interesting to note. Also, just west of Makivka, another 4.2 square kilometers captured. And interestingly, we have here nearly 5 square kilometers, again, captured west of the Zherbets River, with the approach being towards Orikhiv. Orikhiv is, again, an important village. There is a large road network pushing to its west. And you could see that all in all, the Russians advanced through areas that are open in nature, that are not necessarily being contested all the time, because there could be a difficult for Ukrainians to hold on to some of these fields, some of these forests. Now, the Russian forces are trying to do that, trying to emulate and take over these positions in their entirety. We also know that zooming northwards, I want to look at the Kursk region, and I do apologize profusely for not talking about it in more detail. I just have horrible luck because all the most groundbreaking news and the sort of awe-inspiring events that end up occurring, they always do when I'm studying for some tests. But just to get back on track, we can see that I've updated the Belgrade map to indicate that a smaller chunk of Belgrade actually is under Ukrainian control at this point. It only amounts to 4.4 square kilometers, and it's just open forested areas that are on the border with Sumy, and that's about it. So we are also aware of a resumption in Ukrainian attacks towards Kursk, but not from the area that we previously were aware of. It's actually coming further to the west from Tetkino. And this is actually an area that is on paper understandable, because it would have been wise for the Ukrainians, in conjunction with their attacks that occurred in August of last year in the Kursk region, to also attack in Tetkino. And that would give, if we're going back in history, it would have given the Ukrainians this sort of two-pronged maneuver to push towards Krenovo, and then also at the same time push along the river over here, the Snegos River, and cut off all the bridges, cut off all the nearby villages like Shkovo, and that way just sort of neuter any Russian resistance that's sort of present in between. But eventually the Ukrainians just put most of their eggs into one basket and focused on a singular vector for exploitation and pushing deeper into Russian territory. But now we're seeing that once the original Kursk operation is on the back burner, that we're seeing an activation of Ukrainian activity across the border. And I believe that a lot of it has to do with trying to distract the Russians from their own movements in Sumy. And so instead of just using this sort of defense, this grinding attritional defense, they're trying to go with a proactive attack, trying to thereby sort of just trap Russian units in a perpetual state of having to clear out the border, because it's obviously the duty for Russian soldiers and for Russian National Guardsmen and Border Patrol to ensure there are no, outside external actors on their border. And you could see the Ukrainians understand the nature of the urgency of the Russians to sort of take over some of these areas to prevent, you know, crisis with the entire nearby region. But what I'm trying to say is that they send in small squads, 10 to 15, and they get entrenched, these Ukrainian soldiers, in forested areas, in basements, in houses, whatever it may be. And then they have, as a result, the Russians send in several platoons or company sized formations to surround those small groupings and clear them out. And that will, of course, lead to a lot of casualties or POWs being taken from those Ukrainian units. But at the same time, the Russians pour in the resources that to move in armored vehicles and the entire sort of nearby command apparatus and whatever forces are involved to reach closer to whatever part of the front line may be compromised. And there could be numerous vectors that are opened up by the Ukrainian side, not even concurrently at differing times, in order to sort of play whack a mole with the Russian side. And the goal is to just drag out Russian attention, make it sort of diverts away from attacking Sumy and towards defending in these areas. And then once the Russian forces are involved, it becomes very difficult to fully clear out those small squads of Ukrainian soldiers from the border, because those soldiers are obviously not engaging the larger Russian groupings. They are inviting drone crews from the Sumy side of the border to attack any force that is spotted out in the open approaching the 10 to 15 man group that the Ukrainians set up within Tetkino, for instance. And that's how they're able to drag out fighting and lead to higher Russian casualties in the process. So that's the thinking behind Ukraine's operation, and that's why I don't think it will be the last one. There will be others like this once the transient state in Tetkino ends up being stabilized, which it will. And let's just look at the developments from over here. There are a lot of geolocations from western Tetkino of FAB strikes onto Ukrainian infantry that are walking through the village. Here's May 6th, Russian FAB strike, May 8th, Russian airstrikes on western Tetkino. That was, of course, during the ceasefire period. May 7th, 3 Ukrainian soldiers were spotted in western Tetkino. And then the maximum advances from May 8th. It's just, once again, bombardment of individual houses where Ukrainians were spotted. And we're seeing a large amount of aerial assets being devoted to this area, which will naturally then take away from whatever air sorties and campaigns were being conducted elsewhere. We know that the Russians are currently still situated near this rail station, pretty close to the border with Ukraine. This is from May 6th by the Ukrainians, their MiG 29. It struck this train station and Russian houses using 3 GBU 39 JDAM guided bombs. That gives us an indication of where the Russians are still defending. And we know of, in preparation for the entire operation in Tetkino, that in late April, there was this alleged drone complex, this UAV center in Tetkino that was struck by, I believe it was the French hammer bombs. So you had a lot of aerial activity by the Ukrainian side in preparation for this. We also know that as of May 7th, there was another attempt to enter into Tetkino, but through this paved road that is over here. You have to cross over the border. This is this border crossing. It's called the Tetkino border crossing. So the Kozak armored vehicle, this Polish vehicle that the Ukrainians are using, advanced northwards, then took a left turn over here, overran some of the undefended trenches, and then made their way into Tetkino itself before being destroyed first, damaged as a result of a mine, and then destroyed and picked off by an FPV drone. And that's probably not enough to indicate this entire area is under firm Ukrainian control, because that could have been a singular incident of a vehicle attacking along this road. But it does seem like a likely option for the Ukrainians to sort of expand their horizons instead of engaging in a grueling house-to-house battle to push out the Russians. The idea of having troops quickly dismount and then expand deeper into Tetkino to create a situation wherein the Russians are in an isolated position where they are nearly entrenched, sort of nearly enveloped. That would be the Ukrainians' perspective, and they're thinking of how to take over the village in its entirety, or at least its southern portion. At the same time, though, the Russians have moved in reinforcements. They definitely have, and they've already made a difference. You have a lot of forces from the 217th Airborne Regiment and also from the 83rd Airborne Brigade, and they were able to take back some of the Ukrainian excesses that were east of the rail line, and also they engaged in ground clashes, house fighting with 40 to 50 Ukrainian soldiers that are still holed up in a lot of these houses and all of these basements, mainly around this road over here, Ulutisa, Chapeyave, and you could see that it extends into western Tetkino as well. So the Russians are, first of all, involved in stabilizing the situation. We haven't seen any deeper Ukrainian advances over here in a while, and they're trying to now reverse course and individually clear out whatever squads are active in the city of Tetkino, which is very close to the border and is in a compromised position because it is on low elevation. It is in an enveloped position, and again, that means the Ukrainian drone crews have a field day around here throughout the entirety of the day. We also know of one other an area where the Ukrainians tried to approach and cross the border through, and this is an area they've used already to try to divert attention, and this is Novi Put. But again, we can see that it did not end in success. You can see over here from May 7th that there was a large Ukrainian assault organized in an IMR engineering vehicle, two M1013s. They are, and then one Bradley, one Kozak armored vehicle, and they were all destroyed during this attempted breakthrough by the Ukrainian side to overrun the Siervikin line era trenches and anti-tank ditches, Dragon's Teeth obstacles. They were overrun using the, I believe, Vicent mine clearing armored engineering vehicle, originally from Germany, and they paved the way using their engineering equipment at the front and were able to create a path for other Ukrainian vehicles to pass through and then conduct these sort of deep penetrations. Although that never happened over here because they were spotted by the Russian side, their drone crews, and they were targeted then by Russian Lancets. And there are a lot of mines placed around here, which leads to vehicular damage. So both of those vehicles were targeted as a result of the attempt of crossing the border. And now we have just one other video, which is actually from Sumi, but shows a preparation for Ukrainian forces entering into the Kursk region. And this is from the 217th Air Assault Regiment. They hit 4 Ukrainian vehicles as they were approaching the Kursk border, and that's a good indicator of where the Ukrainians were trying to move towards. It would be the northwestern direction, perhaps to join in with the attacks that are now going on along this paved road to approach Tetkino, or maybe just a direct advance through an open field and then pushing northwestwards, whatever it may be. So that's really it for today. I'm really sorry for slurring my speech if I did. It's just like I'm semi-conscious right now because I'm so tired. So I don't even know what I'm saying. But hopefully the video is good and you enjoyed the like 50-minute video. I don't really have a choice because I didn't upload for a week. But that's all for today. Goodbye. Thank you all.